April 19th, 1945. The spring sun cast long shadows across what remained of a factory complex outside Weimar, Germany. The morning light filtered through smoke that still rose from distant fires, creating an amber haze that softened the harsh reality of destruction. The roads leading to the facility were clogged with displaced people moving in every direction, some heading east, others west, all carrying whatever they could salvage from the ruins of the conflict. Wooden carts piled high with belongings creaked along damaged pavement. Children walked beside their parents, with expressions far too old for their faces. Former soldiers in tattered uniforms mixed with civilians in worn clothing, all part of the great unraveling of what had once seemed like an unstoppable force. Among the chaos, a temporary holding area had been established by the advancing Allied forces, a place where German military personnel and civilian administrators were being processed before transfer to larger facilities. The compound occupied what had been an industrial supply depot, with its main warehouse still partially intact, despite damage to one corner from artillery fire weeks earlier. Chain-link fencing topped with barbed wire had been erected quickly, defining the boundaries of the processing area. Guard towers constructed from salvaged lumber stood at the corners, manned by soldiers who watched the steady stream of incoming prisoners with alert but weary eyes. The air in and around the facility smelled of burnt wood, diesel fuel from the constant truck traffic, and the earthy scent of freshly turned soil from nearby craters where ordnance had fallen. There was also the smell of too many people in too small a space, unwashed bodies, inadequate sanitation, the faint odor of fear and uncertainty. Yet despite the crowding and the difficult conditions, there was a sense of organization to the chaos. American military efficiency had imposed structure on what could have easily descended into complete disorder. Sergeant James Mitchell of the 761st Tank Battalion stood at the entrance to the main processing building, clipboard in hand, watching as another group of prisoners was brought in for registration. He had been at this post since just after dawn, and the morning had already brought dozens of people through the system. Each represented a story, a life disrupted, a person trying to navigate the transition from one reality to another. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What none of these prisoners expected, and what Sergeant Mitchell himself could not have anticipated, was that a single moment of human choice would transform not just one life, but would ripple through dozens of others, challenging everything they believed about enemies, allies, and the very nature of dignity in the aftermath of devastation. James Mitchell had been with the 761st since its formation in 1942 at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. The battalion was one of the few all-black tank units in the United States Army, formed at a time when the military was still officially segregated, and many in the military establishment doubted that black soldiers could effectively operate complex machinery like tanks or perform in combat situations. Mitchell himself was 28 years old, originally from Philadelphia, where he had worked as a schoolteacher at a public elementary school in a predominantly black neighborhood. He had taught 5th grade, specializing in mathematics and history, and he had loved the work, seeing young minds develop, helping students grasp concepts that would serve them throughout their lives, being a positive presence in a community that often lacked resources and opportunities. When the conflict began and the nation mobilized, Mitchell had volunteered despite having the option to seek an educational deferment. His reasons were complex. There was patriotism, certainly, a love for his country despite its flaws. There was also a pragmatic understanding that black Americans needed to prove themselves in this crisis if they were to have any hope of advancing their cause for equality afterward. And there was a personal sense of duty, a belief that if he asked his students to be courageous and principled, he needed to model those qualities himself. He stood just under 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and hands that showed both the gentleness of someone who had once guided children through mathematics lessons and the strength required to maintain a Sherman tank under combat conditions. His uniform was dusty but proper, creased where it should be creased, his boots cleaned as well as conditions allowed. His posture was erect despite the exhaustion that seemed to seep into everyone's bones during those final weeks of the conflict. His face showed the weathering of nearly 3 years of military service, fine lines around his eyes from squinting into sun and dust, a certain set to his jaw that came from making difficult decisions under pressure, but also a fundamental gentleness in his expression that his experiences had not eroded. Mitchell had seen combat across France and into Germany. He had been part of operations that broke through defensive lines, had experienced the terror of enemy fire striking his tank, had lost friends and comrades. He carried those experiences with him, as all combat veterans do, but he had not allowed them to make him bitter or cruel. If anything, witnessing so much destruction had strengthened his conviction that every human life had value, and that the way you treated people, even enemies, defined who you were at your core. The assignment to processing duty had come as something of a relief after the intensity of combat operations. As the conflict drew toward its conclusion and organized German resistance collapsed, the battalion had been reassigned from frontline operations to occupation duties. For Mitchell, this meant transitioning from tank commander to administrator, from directing fire against enemy positions to managing paperwork and ensuring orderly processing of the flood of prisoners and displaced persons. The holding area was nothing more than a fenced section of an industrial yard, with a few hastily constructed shelters and a processing station set up in what had once been a warehouse office. Captain Robert Hayes, Mitchell's commanding officer, had assigned him to oversee the documentation of incoming prisoners, recording names, ranks, units, and determining who needed immediate medical attention and who would be transferred to larger facilities. It was tedious work, but Mitchell approached it with the same methodical care he had brought to every task in his military service. Among the personnel already processed that morning were former guards from nearby facilities, administrative clerks from military headquarters, and a handful of civilians who had worked in various capacities for the German military structure. Most showed the same expression, a mixture of exhaustion, relief that the fighting was over, and uncertainty about what would come next. Mitchell treated each with professional courtesy, asking questions in his basic German supplemented by a translator when needed, making notes, ensuring that medical needs were identified. It was just past 10 in the morning when a transport truck arrived with another group. Mitchell watched as they climbed down, noting the variety of uniforms and civilian clothes. There were older men who had clearly been pulled into service in the final desperate months, young women who had served in communications or administrative roles, and a few who wore the worn look of those who had been on the move for days. The translator, a German-American private named Joseph Schneider, stood beside Mitchell as they prepared to process this new group. Among them was a woman in her mid-30s named Margarete Hoffmann. She wore a grey military auxiliary uniform that had seen better days, mud-stained and torn at one sleeve. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back in a braid that had come partially undone, and her face showed the kind of deep fatigue that comes not from a single sleepless night, but from weeks of accumulated stress and fear. Before the conflict, Margaret had been a schoolteacher in Leipzig, specializing in literature and history. When the situation deteriorated and every available person was mobilized, she had been assigned to administrative work at a supply depot, managing inventory records and coordinating shipments. It was mundane work, far from any front line, but it was still service to a cause she had once believed in with certainty. That certainty had begun to crack in small ways over the preceding months. The promises of victory had given way to increasingly desperate orders. The supply depot she worked at had gone from coordinating abundance to managing scarcity, then to simply trying to account for what little remained. She had seen the wounded returning, heard whispers about conditions in various camps, watched as the confident propaganda gave way to grim silence. By the time her unit received orders to evacuate ahead of the advancing Allied forces, Margaret had already begun to question everything she had been told, but she had nowhere else to go and no clear alternative to following orders. The evacuation had been chaotic, roads jammed with military and civilian traffic, contradictory orders, and finally the realization that organized retreat was impossible. Margarete and several others from her unit had been picked up by a rear guard patrol and eventually ended up in the group being processed that morning. She had barely slept in 3 days, had eaten only what she carried in her pack, and she was running on the kind of numb autopilot that comes when the mind can no longer process the scale of change happening around it. As the new arrivals formed a line for processing, Margaret stood with her hands clasped in front of her, trying to maintain some semblance of composure. She had heard rumors about American forces, some terrifying, some almost hopeful. She knew that the units now controlling this area included soldiers of different backgrounds, something that the propaganda she had been raised on had told her was a sign of weakness and chaos in the American military. Yet here they were, victorious, organized, and in control. When her turn came to step forward to the processing station, Margaret moved stiffly, her muscles tight with tension. She had rehearsed in her mind what she might say, how she might present herself, what might happen. But nothing had prepared her for what she saw when she reached the desk. Sergeant James Mitchell looked up from his clipboard, and Margaret found herself facing a black American soldier in a position of authority, asking her questions, recording her information, determining her immediate future. Everything she had been taught, every assumption that had been carefully constructed in her worldview, suddenly seemed to collide with the reality before her. This was not chaos or weakness. This was organization, professionalism, power. Something inside Margaret broke in that moment. Perhaps it was the final dissolution of the propaganda she had been fed for years. Perhaps it was the overwhelming relief that she had survived. Perhaps it was the crushing weight of guilt as she confronted the reality that everything she had believed might have been built on lies. Whatever the cause, the emotion overwhelmed her capacity to stand. Margaret's knees gave way, and she sank to the ground before Mitchell's desk, her hands clasped in front of her in a gesture that was part surrender, part supplication. Tears began streaming down her face, and she began speaking in rapid German, her voice breaking with emotion. She said she was sorry, that she had not known, that she had only followed what she was told, that she understood now how wrong it all had been. The words tumbled out in a mixture of confession and plea, her body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside. The yard, which had been filled with the low murmur of conversation and the administrative sounds of processing, fell silent. Other prisoners in line turned to look. American soldiers supervising different sections paused in their work. Private Schneider, the translator, stood frozen for a moment, uncertain how to proceed. Mitchell set down his clipboard carefully. He looked at the woman kneeling before him, seeing not an enemy combatant or a symbol of an ideology, but a human being in the grip of overwhelming emotion. He had encountered many reactions during the processing: defiance, resignation, fear, relief. But this raw display of collapse was different. He could have responded in several ways. He could have ordered her to stand and compose herself, maintaining the formal distance of captor and prisoner. He could have summoned guards to remove her if he deemed the situation disruptive. He could have responded with coldness or contempt, a natural reaction given the immense suffering that the regime she had served had caused. But James Mitchell was a man who had been shaped by his own experiences of dignity and its denial. He had grown up in a country that declared all men created equal, while maintaining structures of deep inequality. He had excelled in education, earned respect in his community, and then joined a military that initially did not want to give him or soldiers like him the chance to prove their worth. He had served with distinction in a segregated unit, faced skepticism and prejudice, and still maintained his sense of honor and purpose. He understood, perhaps better than many, the complex relationship between individual human worth and the systems that try to define it. Mitchell stood up slowly from behind the desk. The watching crowd seemed to hold its breath. He walked around to where Margaret knelt, and then he did something that no one expected. He knelt down himself, bringing his eyes level with hers. His voice, when he spoke through Schneider's translation, was quiet but clear enough that those nearby could hear. He told her to stand up. He said that there would be time for accountability, time for processing what had happened and what role everyone had played. But this was not that time. This moment was simply about moving forward with dignity. He said that he would not have anyone kneeling before him, not out of defiance or coldness, but because every person, even in defeat, even in guilt, retained their fundamental human worth. He told her that she would be processed, that she would answer questions, that there would be consequences for actions taken during the conflict, but that all of that could happen with her standing on her own feet. Mitchell reached out his hand, offering to help her up. The gesture hung in the air for a moment, laden with significance that everyone present could feel, even if they could not articulate it. Here was a black American soldier, representing a nation and a military that had fought to defeat the regime she had served, offering dignity to someone who had been taught to see him as inferior. Margaret looked at his outstretched hand, and something shifted in her expression. The raw grief was still there, but there was also a kind of wonder, a recognition of grace being offered when judgment would have been justified. She reached out slowly and took his hand, and Mitchell helped her to her feet. He released her hand once she was steady, stepped back and gestured toward the chair beside the desk where prisoners sat during processing. He told her to sit down, to take a moment to compose herself, and that when she was ready, they would continue with the necessary documentation. His tone was professional but not cold, firm but not harsh. He returned to his position behind the desk, picked up his clipboard and waited. The silence in the yard gradually gave way to resumed activity, but the moment had been witnessed and would not be forgotten. Other prisoners in line had seen it. American soldiers supervising the area had seen it, and each of them processed it through their own lens of experience and belief. For Margarete, those next few minutes of sitting and gathering herself were crucial. She wiped her tears, straightened her uniform as best she could, and tried to find some internal footing. When Mitchell began asking the standard questions, name, date of birth, unit assignment, duties performed, she answered as clearly as she could, her voice still shaky but becoming steadier. Mitchell recorded everything with the same methodical care he had shown with every other prisoner that day. When the immediate processing was complete, Mitchell assigned her to a section of the holding area where women prisoners were grouped, ensuring that the guards knew she had been documented and processed. As she was led away, Margaret looked back once at the sergeant, who had offered her an unexpected moment of humanity. She would carry that moment with her through everything that followed. News of the incident spread through the holding area over the course of that day and evening. Stories have a way of traveling quickly in confined spaces where people have little else to do but talk and try to understand their situation. Different people interpreted what they had witnessed in different ways. Among some of the German prisoners, particularly those who still clung to the ideology they had been taught, there was confusion and discomfort. The propaganda had taught them that the Allied forces, and particularly integrated units like the 761st Tank Battalion, represented disorder and weakness. Yet what they had witnessed was discipline, authority, and a kind of moral strength that contradicted everything they had been told. Some dismissed it as an isolated incident, but others found it gnawing at their certainty. Among other prisoners who had already begun questioning what they had been part of, the incident took on different significance. A former logistics officer named Hans Dietrich, who had spent the previous weeks watching the collapse of everything he had thought was powerful and right, found himself thinking about the moment again and again. He had been standing just 3 people behind Margaret in line and had seen the entire exchange. That evening he sought out Private Schneider, the translator, and asked to tell his story to anyone who would record it. He wanted to make clear that he understood now that he had been part of something terribly wrong, and that seeing a moment of grace extended across such a profound divide had crystallized that understanding for him. Among the American soldiers, reactions were also mixed. Some saw it simply as Mitchell doing his job with the same professionalism he always showed. Others recognized it as something more significant, a statement about the values they were fighting for, made real in a single choice. Private Schneider, who had translated Mitchell's words, found himself deeply moved by the exchange. He had joined the army in part to fight against the regime that had persecuted his relatives in Germany, and he carried his own complex feelings about the people he was now helping to process. Seeing Mitchell's response helped him navigate some of those feelings. Captain Hayes, when he was briefed on the incident later that day, nodded thoughtfully. He had served with Mitchell for nearly 3 years and had come to trust his judgment completely. Hayes himself was white, from Virginia, and had his own journey of understanding to navigate when he first took command of a unit of black soldiers. He had learned through experience that character and competence had nothing to do with the racial hierarchies he had been raised to accept, and he had seen his men prove themselves again and again. Mitchell's handling of the situation struck Hayes as entirely consistent with the man's character. Principled, dignified, and effective. The holding area continued to function over the following days, as more prisoners were brought in and processed. Mitchell continued his assigned duties, maintaining the same professional standard he always had, but something had shifted in the atmosphere of the place. There was a quality of thoughtfulness that had not been there before, a sense among many of the prisoners that perhaps the transition from one reality to another might not be as brutal as they had feared. Margaret Hoffman, in her section of the holding area, found herself in conversations with other women prisoners. Some were like her, former teachers, clerks, nurses who had been drawn into service roles. Others had been more directly involved in various aspects of the military administration. As they talked through the long hours, several recurring themes emerged. Most were trying to process what had happened to their country, how the certainty of victory had transformed into complete defeat. Many were worried about what would happen to them, about families they had lost contact with, about how they would survive in whatever came next. But when the conversation turned to the American forces, now controlling the area, several women mentioned the incident they had heard about, the German woman who had collapsed before a black sergeant, and how he had responded. In the retelling, some details were exaggerated or changed, but the core of the story remained consistent. And for many, it became a kind of reference point, a suggestion that perhaps the occupying forces might be different from what they had been led to expect. One woman, a former nurse named Clara Weber, who had worked in a field hospital, shared her own experience that echoed Margaret's realization. She talked about how, as the lines collapsed and they were forced to retreat, they had begun to encounter wounded from both sides. She described treating a young American soldier, barely 20 years old, who had been separated from his unit and injured. She said that as she worked on his wounds, using their dwindling supplies, she had been struck by how he was just a person in pain, no different from the German wounded she had treated for years. She said it had made her question everything about how she had been taught to see the enemy. Margaret listened to these stories and shared her own. She talked about her work at the supply depot, about how she had slowly realized that the impressive organization she thought she was part of was actually a system breaking down under the weight of impossible demands and poor decisions. She talked about the moment at the processing desk, about how seeing Sergeant Mitchell, someone she had been taught to view through a lens of prejudice, in a position of earned authority and watching him choose to offer dignity rather than exercise power, had forced her to confront how thoroughly she had been deceived. The conversations in the holding area, among both prisoners and some of their guards, began to touch on questions that would occupy Germany for years to come. How had so many people been drawn into supporting something so destructive? How did you reconcile the personal conviction that you were a good person with the reality of the harm caused by the system you served? What was the path forward for a society built on lies that had now been exposed? These were not questions that could be answered in a holding area over a few days, but they were beginning to be asked, and that itself was significant. 5 days after her initial processing, Margaret was transferred to a larger facility where more extensive interrogation and classification would take place. The American military had a massive task ahead of them, sorting through millions of people who had been part of the German military and administrative structure in various capacities, determining who bore responsibility for what, who could be released, who needed to face trial. It was an overwhelming undertaking, and the process would take years. Before she was loaded onto the transport truck, Margareta asked Private Schneider if she could pass a message to Sergeant Mitchell. Schneider agreed, and Margareta carefully dictated a short statement. She wanted Mitchell to know that his choice that morning had given her something she had thought was lost, a sense that it was possible to rebuild a life with dignity, even after being part of something shameful. She said that she would carry that moment with her as a reminder of what human decency looked like, and that she hoped in whatever small ways she could, she might extend similar grace to others. Schneider delivered the message that evening. Mitchell listened, thanked him, and said simply that he hoped she found her way forward. He did not see himself as having done anything extraordinary. He had simply treated another person with the respect that he believed every human being deserved. but he was glad if that simple choice had meant something to her. The 761st Tank Battalion continued its duties in the area for several more weeks before being reassigned. During that time, Mitchell processed hundreds more prisoners. Each one was treated with the same professional courtesy, the same methodical care in documentation, the same fundamental respect for human dignity. For Mitchell, the encounter with Margaret Hoffman was one moment among many in the strange and difficult work of managing a population in transition from conflict to whatever came next. But the ripples of that moment continued to spread in ways that were not immediately visible. Among the prisoners who had witnessed the exchange, several would later recall it as a turning point in their own thinking. Hans Dietrich, the logistics officer who had been standing nearby in line, would years later work in reconciliation efforts, helping to educate younger generations about the dangers of propaganda and the importance of recognizing the humanity in everyone. In interviews conducted in the 1960s, he specifically mentioned that moment in the holding area as one of the experiences that had broken through his previous worldview. Clara Weber, the nurse, would eventually emigrate to the United States in the early 1950s. She settled in Pennsylvania and worked at a hospital in Philadelphia. Through a remarkable coincidence, she met James Mitchell years later at a community event. Neither initially recognized the connection. They had barely interacted during the processing, but when the conversation turned to their experiences during the conflict, the connection emerged. They became friendly acquaintances, and Clara would later tell her children that meeting Mitchell again, seeing him back in his role as an educator and community leader, had reinforced for her that the grace she had witnessed extended that day in 1945 was not an isolated gesture, but a reflection of his consistent character. For the men of the 761st Tank Battalion, the incident became part of their collective story. The battalion had fought with distinction throughout the European campaign, but they had also faced discrimination and skepticism from parts of their own military structure. Stories about moments like Mitchell's response to Margaret became part of how they understood their service, not just as warriors, but as representatives of the values their country claimed to hold, even when it did not always extend those values equally to them. After the conflict ended, Mitchell returned to Philadelphia and resumed his career in education. He taught history and civics for more than 30 years, and he often used his experiences during the conflict to help his students understand the complexity of moral choices, the danger of propaganda, and the importance of maintaining human dignity even in difficult circumstances. He rarely spoke about the specific incident with Margaret Hoffman. It was not his nature to highlight his own actions, but he frequently discussed the broader principles it reflected. Margaret Hoffman's story continued in Germany. After months in various processing facilities, she was eventually released and returned to Leipzig, which was now in the Soviet occupation zone. The years that followed were difficult. Germany was divided. Resources were scarce, and the process of confronting what had happened during the conflict was complicated by the Cold War tensions that quickly emerged. Margaret returned to teaching, focusing on literature, and helping to develop curriculum that would give students tools to think critically about the past. In the 1970s, as part of the broader movement to document ordinary experiences during the conflict, Margaret was interviewed for an oral history project. She spoke about her experience during the final weeks, about the collapse of certainty, about her time in the holding area. When she described the moment with Sergeant Mitchell, her voice still carried emotion decades later. She said that she had spent years trying to understand what had made that moment so powerful, and she had come to believe it was because it represented a kind of moral clarity that she had been desperately seeking. In a time when everything seemed confused and compromised, here was someone who had maintained his sense of right action, who had not let the circumstances erode his principles. The interview was preserved in archives that were not widely accessed for many years, but in the 1990s, as more of these oral histories were digitized and made available to researchers, historians began to find threads like Margaret's story. They showed a different dimension of the post-conflict period, not just the large-scale processes of reconstruction and denazification, but the small human moments that helped individuals navigate the moral complexity of that time. Researchers also found references to similar incidents involving members of the 761st and other units. While each situation was unique, a pattern emerged of soldiers who had faced discrimination in their own country, choosing to extend dignity and fairness to defeated populations. Some historians have suggested that these experiences, facing prejudice while also being asked to uphold principles of justice and humanity, gave some soldiers a particular clarity about the difference between exercising power and upholding principle. The broader story of the 761st Tank Battalion became better known over time. For decades after the conflict, the contributions of black military units were often overlooked or minimized in popular histories. But through the efforts of veterans organizations, historians, and family members preserving documents and memories, a fuller picture emerged. The battalion had participated in major operations across France and Germany, had faced enemy fire and proved their capabilities repeatedly, and had helped liberate communities and process the aftermath of the conflict. The men of the battalion had returned to an America that was still deeply segregated, where their service did not immediately translate into equal treatment at home. Many became involved in the civil rights movement, using the contrast between the values they had fought for abroad and the reality they faced at home to push for change. James Mitchell was among them, working through educational channels and community organization to advance equality and justice. The incident between Margaret and Mitchell, while small in itself, became emblematic of larger questions that societies on both sides of the conflict had to grapple with. For Germany, it was part of the painful process of confronting how ordinary people had been complicit in extraordinary evil and how to rebuild a moral framework after that confrontation. For America, it highlighted the contradictions in its own society, a nation that proclaimed liberty and equality while maintaining structures of discrimination whose soldiers exemplified its best values even when those values were not fully extended to them at home. In the years that followed the conflict, as scholars studied the period more deeply, they found that these human moments, small acts of dignity, unexpected grace, choices to uphold principle when it would have been easier to simply exercise power, were surprisingly common, though often unrecorded. They existed alongside all the larger historical forces and dramatic events, and in their own way, they shaped the post-conflict world as significantly as the treaties and policies. The holding area outside Weimar, where Mitchell and Margaret's encounter took place, no longer exists as it was. The factory complex was eventually rebuilt, the temporary structures dismantled. But the moment that occurred there in April of 1945 continued to carry meaning for those who experienced it, and eventually for those who learned about it. For students studying this period, the story offers a window into the complexity of historical moments. It shows how individuals navigated circumstances not of their making, how moral choices could be made even in confused and difficult situations, and how the aftermath of conflict involved not just political and economic reconstruction, but the rebuilding of human dignity and moral understanding. For those interested in military history, it contributes to the growing recognition of the diverse contributions to the Allied victory and the complexity of occupation duties. The image of occupation forces is often simplified in popular imagination, but the reality involved millions of individual interactions, each one an opportunity for either grace or harshness, understanding or revenge. For those interested in the history of civil rights and racial justice, it adds another dimension to understanding how Black Americans navigated their complex position in the mid-20th century, serving a country that did not yet fully recognize their rights, representing its values abroad, and then returning home to continue fighting for those same values to be applied domestically. The story of that moment has been told in various forms over the years, in the oral history Margaret recorded, in interviews with veterans of the 761st, in historical studies of the occupation period. Each telling emphasizes slightly different aspects, but the core remains consistent. A moment of unexpected grace, offered across a profound divide, in circumstances that could have justified a very different response. James Mitchell lived to see many of the changes he had worked for come to fruition. The civil rights movement achieved significant legal victories, even as the work of making those legal changes into lived reality continued. He saw the military officially desegregate, saw black soldiers serve in integrated units, saw opportunities open that had been closed to him and his generation. He retired from teaching in the early 1980s, by which time he had influenced thousands of students, teaching them not just history, but the importance of character and principle. When he was in his 70s, Mitchell was invited to speak at a conference on the history of the conflict, specifically about the experience of black soldiers. He was reluctant at first. He had never sought attention or acclaim, but he was eventually persuaded that his perspective was valuable for understanding that period. During one of the panel sessions, a question came up about memorable moments from his service. After some thought, Mitchell told the story about Margareta, though he did not remember her name at that point, and simply described her as a German woman who had been overwhelmed during processing. He emphasized that he had not done anything he considered remarkable. He had simply treated her as a human being deserving of dignity. But he reflected that perhaps that simple choice had meant something, because it came in a context where dignity was in short supply, where the temptation to respond to past wrongs with present harshness was strong, and where the complexity of guilt and responsibility was overwhelming. He said that he had always believed that maintaining your own principles was not something you did because it was easy, or because people deserved it, but because it was who you chose to be, regardless of circumstances. The story resonated with the audience, and afterward several people came up to speak with him. One was a German academic who studied the occupation period. She told Mitchell that she had actually encountered references to what sounded like this incident in her research, including an oral history from a woman who had been processed at a facility outside Weimar and had described a moment with an American sergeant that had affected her deeply. Mitchell was surprised to learn that the moment had been significant enough to be recorded and preserved. The academic later made the connection between Mitchell's account and Margaret Hoffman's oral history. She contacted both of them. Mitchell was still living at that point, and Margaret was as well, then in her 80s in Leipzig, and facilitated a correspondence between them. The letters they exchanged over the next few years before Margaret's passing were remarkable for their thoughtfulness and their willingness to grapple with difficult questions about guilt, grace, responsibility, and reconciliation. In one of her letters, Margaret wrote that she had spent much of her life trying to reconcile her sense of herself as a good person with the reality that she had been part of a terrible system. She said that moment in the holding area had not absolved her of responsibility. Nothing could do that. But it had given her a model for how to move forward. Mitchell had offered dignity without denying the reality of what had happened, had maintained principle without descending into cruelty, and had shown that it was possible to hold both accountability and humanity in tension. Mitchell, in his response, wrote that he appreciated her honesty and her lifelong effort to face difficult truths. He said that he had come to believe that this kind of ongoing moral work was what mattered most. Not the single moments of choice, but the sustained effort to live with integrity and to help build a better world than the one you inherited. Their correspondence became part of the archival record, adding another layer to the story of that brief encounter in 1945. It showed how a moment that lasted only minutes could continue to generate meaning and reflection decades later, how the ripples of moral choices continued to spread through time. The broader historical context makes the story even more significant. The 761st Tank Battalion and other black units served in a military that was officially segregated until 1948. They faced discrimination in assignments, in recognition, and in the opportunities available to them during and after the conflict. Yet they served with distinction, motivated by a complex mixture of patriotism, desire to prove themselves, and hope that their service might contribute to change at home. The German prisoners they helped to process were coming out of a system that had been built on explicit racial hierarchies and ideologies of superiority and inferiority. The confrontation between these two groups, black American soldiers in positions of authority, German prisoners facing the collapse of their worldview, created moments of cognitive dissonance that forced both sides to grapple with questions about power, dignity, and human worth. that these encounters often resulted in professionalism and fair treatment rather than revenge or harshness, says something important about the individuals involved and the values they chose to uphold. It was not inevitable. There were certainly cases of abuse and mistreatment in the chaotic aftermath of the conflict, though official policy strongly discouraged such behavior. But the preponderance of evidence suggests that most American soldiers, regardless of their background, took seriously their role as representatives of a nation that claimed to stand for certain principles, even when that nation did not always live up to those principles domestically. For the prisoners being processed, the experience of being treated fairly by people they had been taught to despise was often jarring and transformative. It forced a confrontation with the lies they had been told, made it harder to maintain the comfortable fiction that they had simply been caught up in events beyond their control. If the enemy could show greater humanity than the system they had served, what did that say about their own choices? This was part of the broader process of denazification and reconstruction, though it operated at a different level than the formal programs and policies. It was in these individual interactions, these small choices about how to treat other human beings, that the work of building a different kind of society began. The story also touches on the question of how societies recover from periods of profound moral failure. Germany's reckoning with its past has been long and painful, involving generations of difficult conversations, educational efforts, memorial projects, and ongoing vigilance against the resurgence of the ideologies that led to such catastrophe. That process began in small ways in places like the holding area outside Weimar, where people started to confront the reality of what had happened and what they had been part of. For individuals like Margaret, the path forward involved accepting responsibility, while also finding a way to live with meaning and purpose. The moment with Sergeant Mitchell did not erase her guilt or simplify her complicated history, but it gave her a reference point for how to navigate the moral complexity of her situation. She could not undo what had been done, but she could choose how to live in the aftermath, could work to build something better, could extend to others the kind of grace that had been extended to her. The story resonates in the present day as well. Questions about how to maintain principle in difficult circumstances, how to treat people with dignity even when they represent things you oppose, how to hold accountability and humanity in balance. These remain relevant. The temptation to dehumanize those we see as enemies or those who have done wrong is always present, and the choice to resist that temptation is always significant. The historical record shows that James Mitchell made such a choice in a holding area in Germany in April of 1945. It shows that Margaret Hoffmann was profoundly affected by that choice and spent the rest of her life trying to live up to the example it set. It shows that others who witnessed the moment or heard about it found in it something meaningful about how to navigate the difficult terrain of post-conflict recovery and moral reckoning. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time. The work of processing prisoners required not just administrative skill, but also a certain emotional intelligence. Each person who came through represented not just a name on a form, but a complex human story. Some arrived defiant, clinging to remnants of ideology even in defeat. Others came broken, their worldview shattered along with their nation's military power. Many showed simple exhaustion and relief that the fighting was over, regardless of who had won. Mitchell had learned to read these different states and adjust his approach accordingly. With the defiant, he remained professional but firm, making clear that cooperation was not optional, but also not treating them with unnecessary harshness. With the broken, he maintained a respectful distance that allowed them to preserve some dignity. With the exhausted, he moved efficiently to get them processed and to whatever rest might be available. Among the personnel already processed that morning were former guards from nearby facilities, administrative clerks from military headquarters, logistics officers who had managed supply chains, communications specialists, nurses who had worked in field hospitals, and a handful of civilians who had worked in various capacities supporting the German military structure. The range was enormous, from teenagers who had been pressed into service in the final desperate months to older men and women who had been part of the system for years. Most showed the same underlying expression beneath whatever surface emotions they displayed, a mixture of exhaustion, relief that the fighting was over, profound uncertainty about what would come next, and in many cases a dawning realization that everything they had been told might have been lies. Mitchell treated each with professional courtesy, asking questions in his basic German, learned through a crash course and supplemented by experience over recent months, with the assistance of a translator when his language skills fell short. He made careful notes, ensured that medical needs were identified and forwarded to the medical station, flagged any cases that seemed to require additional attention from intelligence officers, and generally kept the process moving as smoothly as the circumstances allowed. Private Joseph Schneider, the translator who worked alongside Mitchell, was himself a study in complicated identity. He was a German-American from Milwaukee, born to immigrant parents who had left Germany in the 1920s. He spoke fluent German with his family growing up, maintained connections to German culture and traditions, but identified thoroughly as American. When the conflict began, he had immediately felt the conflict between his cultural heritage and his national loyalty. He had relatives still in Germany, aunts, uncles, cousins, and he had no idea what their circumstances might be or what role they might have played in the regime's activities. But he had never questioned where his own loyalty lay. He had joined the army, his language skills had been identified and utilized, and he had served as translator in various capacities throughout the campaign. Working alongside Mitchell had been an education for him in multiple ways. He had grown up in a neighborhood that was largely white, and he had absorbed many of the casual prejudices of his time and place without really examining them. But watching Mitchell work, seeing his competence, his fairness, his steady character, had forced Schneider to confront and discard those prejudices. They had developed a good working relationship built on mutual respect and shared commitment to doing their jobs well. It was just past 10 in the morning when a transport truck arrived with another group. The truck was a captured German vehicle being put to Allied use, its original markings painted over, but still visible beneath the fresh coat. It pulled up to the processing area with a rattling sound that suggested mechanical problems likely to worsen. The back gate dropped open, and about 20 people climbed down, showing the usual variety of backgrounds and circumstances. Mitchell watched as they disembarked, making quick assessments that came from weeks of experience. There were older men who had clearly been pulled into service in the final desperate months. You could tell by their ill-fitting uniforms and the way they moved, lacking the bearing that comes from extensive military training. There were young women who had served in communications or administrative roles, many showing the effects of poor nutrition and stress. A few appeared to have been on the move for days, their clothing torn and stained with mud, their faces showing that particular exhaustion that comes from uncertainty and fear about the future. Some carried small bags or bundles containing whatever possessions they had managed to hold on to. Others had nothing but the clothes they wore. The group was directed to form a line leading to the processing desks. American soldiers armed with rifles supervised, not aggressively but with clear authority. The atmosphere was tense but not threatening. The prisoners shuffled into position, some talking quietly among themselves, others standing in silent isolation with their thoughts. Among them was Margaret Hoffman. She stood near the middle of the group, her posture upright despite her obvious fatigue. She wore a grey military auxiliary uniform that had seen better days. Mud-stained up to the knees, torn at one sleeve where it had caught on something, missing several buttons so that she had to hold it closed with one hand. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back in a braid that had come partially undone, strands falling loose around her face. Her eyes were dark-circled from lack of sleep, and her face showed the kind of deep fatigue that comes not from a single sleepless night, but from weeks of accumulated stress, fear, and the mental strain of watching everything you thought was solid dissolve into chaos. Before the conflict, Margaret had lived what she considered a good life in Leipzig. She had been a school teacher, specializing in literature and history at a girls' secondary school. She loved her work, introducing students to the great works of German literature, helping them understand the sweep of history, encouraging them to think critically about the world around them, or at least she had thought she was encouraging critical thinking. Looking back now, she realized how much of what she taught had been filtered through the regime's perspective, how much propaganda had been woven into even seemingly neutral academic subjects. She had not been a zealous supporter of the regime, had not joined political organizations enthusiastically, had not attended rallies with passionate conviction. But she had gone along. She had accepted the narrative she was given. She had believed, or at least not questioned strongly enough, when told that her nation was defending itself, reclaiming its rightful place, correcting historical injustices. She had been frightened by some of what she heard, rumors that seeped through despite censorship. But she had told herself that surely the authorities knew better. Surely things were not as bad as the whispers suggested. Surely her duty was to support her country in difficult times. When the situation deteriorated and every available person was mobilized, Margarete had been assigned to administrative work at a supply depot about 30 kilometers from Leipzig. The work was mundane, managing inventory records, coordinating shipments, processing requisition forms. It was far from any front line, involved no direct participation in combat operations, and seemed harmlessly bureaucratic. But even in that role, Margaret had begun to see the cracks in what she had been told. The supply depot she worked at had gone from coordinating abundance to managing scarcity, then to simply trying to account for what little remained. The requisitions that came through told their own story. Increasingly desperate requests for basic supplies, equipment that should have been replaced long ago still being patched together for continued use, shortages of everything from fuel to food to medical supplies. She had seen the wounded returning, transported through their facility en route to hospitals, and their numbers and condition spoke to a reality very different from the official reports of strategic repositioning and temporary setbacks. She had heard whispers about various camps and facilities, about things being done that seemed impossible to reconcile with any moral framework. At first, she had dismissed such talk as enemy propaganda. Then she had tried to tell herself that surely such things, if they happened at all, were isolated incidents being addressed by authorities. Eventually, as the whispers continued and multiplied, as the evidence became harder to ignore, she had been forced to confront the possibility that the system she was part of might be built on foundations of profound evil. That realization had been crushing. It meant that her comfortable assumptions about her country, her leaders, her own role, were all potentially false. It meant that by going along, by not questioning strongly enough, by doing her assigned duties without protest, she might bear some responsibility for terrible things. It meant that the life she had lived, the beliefs she had held, the identity she had constructed for herself as a good person doing her best in difficult times, all of that might be a comfortable fiction hiding an ugly truth. When her unit received orders to evacuate ahead of the advancing Allied forces, Margaret had followed those orders because she had no clear alternative, no other place to go, no framework for understanding what else she might do. The evacuation had been chaotic from the start. Roads were jammed with military and civilian traffic, all trying to move in different directions, based on contradictory orders and rumors. Communications broke down, command structures dissolved. What had been an organized military system fragmented into small groups and individuals just trying to survive and find safety. Margaret and several others from her supply depot had been picked up by a rearguard patrol and incorporated into a larger group being moved westward. There had been talk of regrouping at some defensive position, of forming a new line, of continuing organized resistance. But it had all been empty words covering the reality that the conflict was over, the regime was finished, and all that remained was to avoid being caught in the final violent spasms of its collapse. Eventually, inevitably, their group had been overtaken by advancing American forces and directed to the processing facility outside Weimar. Margaret had barely slept in 3 days. She had eaten only what she carried in her pack, some bread that was now stale and hard, a bit of cheese, half a canteen of water carefully rationed. She was running on the kind of numb autopilot that comes when the mind can no longer process the scale of change happening around it. She knew that her previous life was over. She knew that she would face judgment of some kind for her role, however small, in the system that had just collapsed. She knew that the comfortable certainties that had structured her understanding of the world were gone, but she did not yet know what would replace any of it, or how to navigate whatever came next. As the line moved forward slowly, each person stepping up to be processed and then directed to some section of the holding area, Margaret tried to maintain some composure. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, the knuckles white with tension. Her jaw was clenched against the trembling that threatened to take over her whole body. She kept her eyes forward, not meeting anyone's gaze, focusing on just getting through the next moment and then the next. She had heard rumors about American forces, a confusing mixture of terrible warnings and unexpected stories of fair treatment. The propaganda she had been fed for years had painted the Allies as brutal and vengeful, particularly emphasizing claims about the chaos that would supposedly result from integrated military units. But she had also heard whispered accounts from those who had already been processed elsewhere, stories suggesting that the Americans were generally following proper procedures, treating prisoners according to international conventions, even showing unexpected kindness in some circumstances.